Ebola first came to my attention when I was following the BBC on a nightly basis after Russia had invaded the Ukraine. And I was looking at that news every night. And at the same time, Ebola started to blip up. And Ebola in West Africa was becoming a big crisis situation. And I knew about Ebola. I mean, I focus on virology and immunology, so I've read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of medical journal articles about not only HIV, but other viruses as well. So I knew in the medical literature there was research that showed that when they had an outbreak of Marburg virus in Angola, German researchers had treated Marburg virus, which is the closest virus to Ebola, with selenium, and they had 100% results. They had almost no deaths from Marburg virus that should have killed 90% of the patients that they had. So I went back through my research because I have copies of all the medical journals that medical journal articles that I've read, and I went back through those articles and also found a number of articles on other hemorrhagic fever viruses such as hantavirus, which is very common in China, and there's a little bit in southwestern US. And the Chinese had treated hantavirus with selenium and had major reductions of 70, 80, 90% by treating hantavirus patients with selenium. So I took this, I got all this information together, and then I went up to Pretoria to the embassies of the countries that were involved. There was no embassy from Sierra Leone, but there was an embassy from Guinea, and there was an embassy from Liberia. I shared the information with the staff at the embassy, and at least in the case of Liberia, they sent it up to the Ministry of Health in Liberia. Liberia Ministry of Health reviewed that information and sent word back, please send this man to Monrovia as soon as possible. We want to try the selenium. So I asked them, could they pay for my plane fare to fly to Liberia? And they said, no, we can't pay for your plane fare, but please come. So I took 60 bottles of selenium. I paid for my airfare to Liberia, and it was such an important thing that they sent a member of the Supreme Court to pick me up at the airport. She picked me up at the airport. Immediately I went into meetings with people from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The next morning I had a meeting with the Minister of the Interior, who was a co-chair along with the President of Liberia on this Ebola emergency task force. That afternoon I went into meetings with the Chief Medical Officer from the Ministry of Health. She called the head of the Carter Center in Liberia, who was an advisor to the Ministry of Health. They reviewed the information that I was talking about. We had a good conversation, and they immediately sent the selenium down to the chief doctor that was working at the Ebola treatment unit, who was Dr. Jerry Brown. He put the selenium into the Ebola patients, and within just a few days there was positive results. Eventually, after Ebola was all over, Dr. Jerry Brown was named Time Magazine's Man of the Year. But what we saw in the Ebola patients was that even at a suboptimal dose of selenium, which they used 1.2 milligrams of selenium in the Ebola patients, I had recommended 2 milligrams based on the research in Angola and China, but because they had a limited amount of selenium, they used only 1.2 milligrams per day on the Ebola patients. and that cut the dying within 2 weeks. The survival rate, the best of the survival rate they had before was 45% survival rate. Within 2 weeks in that Ebola treatment unit, the survival rate went up to 68%. So it was about a 46.8% improvement in survival, even using a suboptimal dose. If they had used the proper dose that I recommended, survival rate should have gone to 75%. So that proved the benefits of selenium in treating Ebola virus disease, but that information was not disseminated worldwide like it should have been. But the Ministry of Health in Liberia took the response that they ordered 1 bottle of selenium for every Ebola patient that they had, 2,468 bottles of selenium. And we brought it into Liberia, and that's one of the reasons that Liberia, which had was hardest hit and had the worst part of the Ebola outbreak, was able to get the Ebola outbreak under control faster and better than Sierra Leone and Guinea. The response of the international community was very interesting. Even after the government, the Ministry of Health of Selenium of Liberia, had shown in their Ebola treatment unit that selenium was effective, Médecins Sans Frontières, an international organization that helps in these kind of outbreaks all over the world, they didn't want to use it. I was very interested in talking with the head of the Ebola program for Médecins Sans Frontières in Liberia, because we were in the same meetings at the Ministry of Health, the emergency meetings that happened on a daily basis. And he said he'd been fighting Ebola for 25 years in the Congo and had never heard of selenium. Well, once you hear of something and it works, then you should start using it. But Médecins Sans Frontières chose not to use it. Of course, the World Health Organization knew nothing about it either. They're very good at helping contain an outbreak, but they, of course, believed the common knowledge that there was no treatment, there was no cure. No treatment, no cure. So if you know that and believe that there's no treatment, no cure, why should you even consider a treatment? Even though we proved it on the ground in the Ebola treatment unit. Ebola is not over. Ebola, there have been 2 outbreaks of Ebola in the Congo this year. The first one was quickly suppressed, as are most outbreaks of Ebola. But the other one in Kivu province in the eastern province of the Congo is now getting out of control. You've had over 200 deaths, and you've had more than 300 other people infected. Now, supposedly, there's a drug to treat Ebola. If they combined it, we're not sure how effective that drug is, and there's also a vaccination against Ebola. We don't know how effective that vaccination is, but they're not using selenium because they did not learn the lesson from the last huge outbreak of Ebola. We need to learn these lessons, and it's interesting that there's a post-Ebola syndrome. The people that were infected by Ebola in Liberia and West Africa who survived now suffer from, you could call it post-Ebola syndrome. They have a group of different maladies and conditions, and interestingly enough, when you list those different conditions in post-Ebola syndrome, they can all be treated by selenium.